Hello, everyone, and welcome to the University of Rhode Island Computer Science and Statistics. In today's lesson, we are going to continue our conversation on Docker. In our previous lesson, we learned about how to install and set up Docker, and we learned that Docker was essentially a repository or a platform as a service that is, in a lot of ways, different from a virtual machine where we can capitalize on the resources that we have when it comes to our applications. So in this lesson, we are going to learn about the Docker repository. Okay. The Docker repository is essentially a collection of related Docker images with the same name but different tags. And we're going to really learn about what the Docker repository is and the different capabilities that exist when it comes to that repository. Okay. So let's start. Okay. So we first started off talking about what Docker is. To some of you, I'm pretty sure that this is a new concept. So Docker, in a lot of ways, is different from a virtual machine, which we discussed earlier, in the sense that you can interact and deploy images without really having to use the full resources or the bottlenecks that often a virtual machine would bring. And as you recall, I mentioned that when you use virtual machines, it really uses a lot of resources. You have to install its own separate operating system, its own tools, resources, and services to really utilize it. So you essentially have to deploy a lot when you're using a VM versus a Docker. So a Docker has containers, which we discussed, and each container can be very different as it relates to the application. All right. So in a lot of ways, Docker really gives you the best bang for your buck when it comes to utilizing different applications and really maximizing the capabilities of that without being too resource heavy. So a Docker is essentially a tool that can be packaged, that can package an application and its dependencies in a virtual container. Okay. And can be hosted on any machine. So the Docker tool is designed to make it easy to create, deploy, and run applications. So you can think of this as software as a service that can be deployed regardless of the architectures or some of the complications that used to come with it. You can actually utilize a Docker to deploy that. Okay. So let's talk about the Docker architecture. So the Docker architecture is responsible for managing the Docker objects. The Docker daemon listens for Docker API requests and manages all Docker objects. So Docker objects include images, containers, networks, and volumes. So when you're utilizing Docker, once you actually deploy um, exactly what it is that you need with Docker, one of the things that you have to keep in mind when using Docker is you're always going to need a lot of the various tools and resources that would also come with that application. And you can actually deploy all of that inside of that container, which we will talk about a little bit. Okay. Once you have successfully installed your Docker, what you will be interacting with, if you recall correctly, what you will be interacting with in our case here is the Docker client, right? So if I do Docker dash dash version, right, you could see the version that I'm running. So if I'm going to interact with Docker, what I'm essentially going to be interacting with is what is known as the Docker client. Okay, so the Docker client is primarily the way that a user interacts with Docker, right? And the Docker client uses the Docker API to communicate with Docker, and the Docker API commands are sent to the Docker. Okay, so the Docker client can communicate with more than one daemon at a time, so definitely keep that in mind. The Docker architecture also has what is known as Docker registries. Your Docker registries are where all of your downloaded images from Docker are stored. So you can download Docker images by using the Docker pull, push, or Docker run command from your configured registry. So let me give you an example of what that looks like using Docker. So here I am, okay? And if I wanted to download, let's say, Fedora, I would do Docker pull, and I could just specify Fedora, all right? and I would be able to download the latest version of Fedora. And as you can tell, I already have Fedora installed here. So that's why you could see that I don't really need to do it. But let's install a version of Linux that is known as Alpine so you could see what that would look like, right? So I'm going to do the same thing, Docker pull, and I'm going to download Alpine, right? And here must be lowercase, Alpine, right? Oh, I wrote it wrong. Yeah, Alpine, right? And here I'm downloading a version of Alpine, which is a flavor of Linux that exists in Docker. All right. So let's continue. You also have what is known as the Docker store, which allows for us to purchase, buy, and sell Docker images or distribute them for free once we create them. Okay. Docker images are essentially read only templates, but you can really pull all the tools that you will essentially need to download and run your Docker to make sure that it runs and works properly. Right. So you have your Docker client and your Docker registry. From there, you will need to have what is known as your Docker hub. So I'm going to launch my Docker, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Docker, and I'm going to write login, okay? And from here, you will notice that it's going to ask me for a username and a password, okay? So in order to successfully log into Docker, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to actually create a Docker account. So I'm pretty sure you're asking, how do you create a Docker account? So to do that, we're going to go to https://hub.docker.com to navigate over to Docker. So I'm actually going to log out because this is actually my account that I created. And for you, in order to log in, you're going to have to go to sign up for Docker Hub. You're going to choose a Docker ID. You're going to specify an email address. You're going to specify a password. You're going to agree to Docker's terms and services. And then you're going to sign up and you're going to get an email confirmation to set up Docker. From there, you're going to use your password and your Docker ID to log into Docker. So once you've successfully registered and created a Docker hub to interact with your Docker client, you're going to go back to your Linux server, and I'm going to use my Docker ID, which is 082414. Okay, then I'm going to put my password in, and I will have successfully logged into Docker. Okay, so now essentially what I am able to do is here I can actually I've logged into what is known as my Docker repository, right? So here is essentially what my Docker repository looks like. It looks just like this. So just to show you, I'm going to log in. Okay. So I've successfully logged into my Docker repository. Once you log in, my Docker hub. Once you log in, one of the things you want to do is you want to create a repository, which is essentially one of the many containers that you can have. You can have as many containers as you want. You can deploy as many images as you want. You can test as many applications as you would like to using Docker. So from here, I'm going to create a repository, right? And I'm going to call this one application underscore Devo. Okay. So this is going to be where my application development is going to go. I'm going to write testing application development. All right. So I am going to create an application Devo repository. I'm going to select create. I now have a repository called application Devo. I'm going to copy this just so that way I know I can remember it. So now when I go to my repositories, you will notice that I have a few that I created already, right? So here I have the application Devo. I have an Alpine repository, right? And then I have an App1 repository, right? And as you can tell, there's already images in my Alpine repository that I created earlier, which I probably should have deleted, but let's actually do that right now. Well, we have to delete it in the client. So here it is, but I'm not going to interact with this one just to kind of show you. I'm actually going to interact with the application devo because that's the one I just created it. And you notice there's nothing in here right now. Okay. So now, one that I've successfully logged into my hub, what I want to do is I want to actually install um, the Linux flavor that I just talked to you about, which is the Alpine. So to do that, I would simply do docker pull Alpine, but since it's already there, it's no, the latest version's there, so I'm not going to be able to see much. But in order to take a look at the images that I have, I would write docker images. Right, and you'll notice that I have two flavors of Linux currently running on my system, and they are the following, right? I have Docker, I have Fedora Linux in my container, a repository for Fedora, and I have a repository for Alpine. All right. So let's say I wanted to take that repository and move it over to that container that I just essentially created. What I can do is I can actually create an instance of that repository and tag it in order to push it into my Docker hub. So that way I can interact with it in various ways. So to do that, I'm going to actually push the Fedora and the Alpine into my application development. So from there, I'm going to write docker tag. Okay, what am I trying to tag? I'm trying to tag Fedora, which is one of my images, and I want to push it to the application development stage. So I'm actually going to use the image ID. So the first three letters of that image ID, I'm going to call on, which is D09, okay, space, and I'm going to use the Docker Hub user ID that I used to log in, which was 082414. Okay. And I'm going to go back just to verify that that is actually correct. So here it is, 082414. So it's 082414, 082414. That looks good. Okay. And what am I trying to push? I'm going to do slash. Okay. What I would like to do is push the Fedora image into the application development repository. So I'm going to paste it because I copied it, right? So application development, okay? And I'm going to create an instance of this, different ones, right? So I'm going to do a testing one, okay? I'm going to press enter. So that's the first instance that I created of Fedora. And then I'm going to do a testing 2, right? So I'm creating multiple images of the same exact Linux image. And then I'm going to bring over the Alpine image as well. So I'm going to change the ID to 5CB because I want to bring them both over. And this one, I'm not going to write testing. I'm going to write penetrate. Let's do linked in 1 for the Alpine, okay? Then let's do a LinkedIn 2, right? So essentially what I did here is I tagged both my Linux flavors. I tagged Fedora and Alpine. And what I would like to do now is I would like to push them and bring them over to my repository, right? So right now you notice that I just have Fedora and Alpine because those are the generic images. So if I was to run back a Docker images, I should have 2, 4, 6 instances of that image that exist in my repository. When I click it, you will notice that I have 6 instances, right? I have application, testing 1, testing 2, application, testing, LinkedIn 1, LinkedIn 2, and they are all related to these images, right? One of them's for Alpine, 2 different instances. One of them's for Fedora, 2 different instances as well, okay? So what I would like to do now is I would like to push them up to my Docker hub so I can take a look at what they look like so I can interact with them or see if I can actually send them over from my client. So to do that, we're simply going to do a Docker push, right? And then I'm going to again do my ID 082414 / I'm going to paste this one more time, application development. Okay, so that is now going to push, make sure you write push, not what I wrote here. So Docker push, all right, my Docker Hub ID in the repository that I created in my Docker Hub. So if everything worked correctly, this should be pushed up to that repository, right? When I click enter, it's preparing it and it said it mounted it, it already exists, and it's saying it already exists because in an instance of that repository already exists. So now if I go over to my Docker Hub, I want to take a look to see if I have a image there now, right? So I downloaded the Fedora image in my Docker client. I tagged it and created different instances of the image so I can interact with those different repositories to not affect the original one. And I pushed it over to my Docker Hub. So let's take a look to see if I now have a Linux flavor in my Docker Hub. And when I refresh, yes, I do, right? You notice here that I have a testing 1, a testing 2, I have a LinkedIn 2, and a LinkedIn 1, right? So I have these different flavors that were brought over, right? Operating system Linux, operating system Linux, operating system Linux, operating system Linux. So I actually was able to bring over, right, both of these instances that I created into my Docker Hub. So that is how you can interact with your Docker repository and bring your images into your Docker Hub and interact with them, right? And the reason you want to create different instances is so you can kind of see how easy it is to really essentially interact with these images and see exactly what is going on with them. Okay, so now one of the things we might want to do is, we definitely don't want to have all these different instances of, Fedora and Alpine exists because, this was just for testing purposes. So what we want to do is we would like to remove them. So to remove images from your Docker Hub or your Docker client, so if I was to do right now Docker images, you will notice that I have a bunch of images here that I'm really not going to use. So I'm going to do a Docker image RM, okay? And all we're going to do is call on the ID of those images to simply get rid of them. So I'm going to do Docker image RM, and I'm going to call on D09, right? Because D09, I have 3 instances of that image. And when I press enter, you'll notice that it is saying that I cannot remove that image. However, I can forcefully remove that image. So you notice it says it must be forced. So I'm going to just write -F to forcefully remove it. And you'll notice that it's been removed. So if I check my Docker images, I now only have an instance of Alpine that exists. So I was able to remove the Fedora. So I can actually remove Alpine as well simply by doing the same thing, calling on that images ID 5CB, right? Enter, and I was able to delete it. So now if I was to do images, you will notice that there is no more images left in my repository. So that's how you can download an image from the Docker store, interact with it by bringing it over to your Docker Hub, and this is how you can easily remove it. And this is very useful if you want to do application testing and you want to have different instances of tests that you want to do. And you can simply create repositories, put them in containers, download and install exactly what it is that you want to utilize them for. And then you can simply remove them as you see fit, or you can save them, store them to your Docker Hub, password protect them, and really see what some of the capabilities are when it comes to your Docker. Thank you for watching.